scheint aufzunehmen. Ganz herzlich willkommen zu diesem zweiten Vortrag unserer Vorlesungsreihe Familie im östlichen Europa zwischen Gesellschaft, Politik und Alltag. Ich gebe gleich die Anwesenheitsliste rum für die Studierenden, damit ich es nicht vergesse, und die Liste für den Newsletter, wo man sich eintragen kann, wenn sich nochmal jemand eintragen möchte. Die letztes Mal nicht da waren, möchte ich noch darauf hinweisen, dass der Vortrag aufgezeichnet wird und eben auch die Diskussion. Ich freue mich nun sehr, Dr. Ivana Dobrivojević Tomić begrüßen zu dürfen und möchte sie kurz vorstellen, werde dies, weil auch der Vortrag ist, auf Englisch tun. A very warm welcome to you here at the University of Bern. We are very happy you made the long trip from Belgrade to Bern. Ivana Dobrivojević Tomić works as a research fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History in Belgrade. She studied at the Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade at the Department of History of Yugoslavia, where she wrote her master's thesis, State Repression During the Dictatorship of King Alexander from 1929 until 1935. Of course, this publication is available in our library. Ivana continued her research in her doctoral thesis entitled Village and City, Transformation of Serbia's Agrarian Society from 1945 until 1955. In Serbian, Selo I grad, transformacija agrarnog društva Srbije, 1945 od 1945 do 1955. Her third book was published last year and bears the same title as today's talk, Between Carelessness and Ignorance, Women, Sexuality and Family Planning in Yugoslavia. In Serbia, između nebrige I neznanja, žene, seksualnost I planiranje porodice u Jugoslaviji. Ivana has also contributed numerous articles, both in Serbian and English. This year, for example, her article State and Parenthood, Family Planning Policy in Socialist Yugoslavia was published in the book Biopolitics in Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. This book is available in our library as an e-book. And I will pass around the 3 books and also a copy of the article. Like that. These publications give us a nice insight into some of Ivana's fields of interest, political and social history of interwar Yugoslavia, urbanization and modernization processes in socialist Yugoslavia, and the life of ordinary people under communism. To round off this short introduction, I would like to mention that Ivana Dobrivojević Tomić has also done research at institutes in Germany and Austria. She was a visiting researcher at the Imre Kertész College in Jena, at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg, and at the Institute for Southeast European History in Graz. And now we very much looking forward to your lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jan, for the introduction and, of course, for the invitation to be here tonight. As you already heard, my talk will be based on this book. This is like the shortest possible summary of the book. So my first idea was to research only family planning policy in socialist Yugoslavia. But soon I realized that it was the part actually of the process of demographic transition that in some regions of Yugoslavia started even before the Second World War, actually during 1920s and 1930s. So in order to have like a complete overview on the situation and to be able to fully analyze the process from the beginning to its end, that is why I decided to include also the family planning policy and attitudes towards abortion and sexuality in the interwar Yugoslavia as well. The book is based mainly on the sources that are kept in the archives of Yugoslavia, on periodicals, expert articles published in expert journals, books and booklets written by historians, anthropologists, sociologists, demographers, but also by doctors. And those articles and books which were written by gynecologists were very useful for me. They offered completely different perspective than, let's say, usual historical sources. And I could use them in many cases as a source, so they were most valuable. So in this lecture, I will try to give an overview of the situation. I will focus on the demographic transition in the interwar Yugoslavia. I will talk something about abortion, a little bit about sexuality and contraception, and then I will talk about family planning policy in socialist Yugoslavia, attitudes of the Communist Party towards abortion. Also, I will try to say something about contraception, and I'm not sure that I will have time to talk anything about sex education, actually attempts of including the sex education into school curricula, but if you're interested in the topic, we can leave it for the discussion, and position of women we can also discuss during the discussion, and whatever you find interesting and I don't have the time to mention, just please ask. So before I start, maybe I should just say several sentences about Yugoslavia. I'm sure that you already know, but just to be on the safe side, Yugoslavia was one of the most underdeveloped countries in the whole Europe during the interwar period. So population was predominantly rural, and almost, I would say 70 to 80% of the population was illiterate or poorly literate. So the educational level of the population was low, and they were somehow compelled to live in the village in the single village where they were born for the whole life, because opportunities to find a job in town were really very scarce, since Yugoslavia was also industrialized, so it was not easy to find a job in town. After the Second World War, when the Communist Party seized the power, situation partly changed. A lot of people who were living in really poor conditions in the villages had the opportunity to move to towns because of rapid industrialization and urbanization. That was on the plus side, but on the minus side, they were facing almost the same challenges as they did face in the villages, because the housing shortages, the low standard of living, etc., their educational level was still low, because those were the people who had 20, 30 years when they moved. So they faced various challenges. And also, this is quite important for the topic. I will discuss it later when I discuss the sexuality in the interwar Yugoslavia, in the socialist Yugoslavia. So to start, I will tell you something about the demographic transition. And as I already mentioned, Yugoslavia was one of the poorest countries. but after the unification, the regions that were united in Yugoslavia were on different levels of economic development. For example, parts of Slovenia, parts of Croatia, parts of Serbia were much more developed than underdeveloped parts, for example, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, southern Serbia, Montenegro, etc. So these economic differences, along with cultural differences and social differences, affected family life and family relations, and of course affected demographic trends. So according to the statistic, there was 29 births per 1,000 of inhabitants in 1935. Still, the statistics mask the real situation, the real demographic situation in Yugoslavia, since the country was divided into two regions. One which was significantly smaller, that was in the north of the Sava and Danube River, and significantly bigger region south from those rivers. So in this smaller northern region, the birth rate was to some extent similar to the birth rate in the Central and Western Europe. But in this bigger and poorer region, the birth rate was high and extremely high. So in Vardarska Banovina, this is the region of today's Macedonia, actually ex-Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. The birth rate was around 40 per mil. And also in Vrbaska Banovina, this is the region in Bosnia around today's city of Banja Luka. Also the birth rate was around 40 per mil. And there were some counties in Bosnia, like Cazin, Travnik, Jajce, where the birth rate was around 60 per mil. So those birth rates of 40 and 60 per mil were among the highest birth rates in the world at that time. And I think that only birth rate in India was a bit bigger than this birth rate in, for example, Jajce and Cazin. So paradoxically, despite this great poverty in which people lived, somehow they cherished big families, and spouses desired for numerous offsprings. In those areas, it was believed that the children represent the will of God, against which no one should act. So spouses didn't even think to limit birth. Of course, they didn't know how to do it, but everyone desired numerous offspring. On the other hand, in more prosperous regions, especially, for example, in Slavonia, this is part of Croatia, in some parts of northern Serbia, also in some villages in western Serbia, in Slovenia as well. These patriarchal views on children, according to which children were regarded as the source of happiness and intangible wealth, started to change because couples were afraid for the existence of their family. So their main goal was to secure the children and provide for the children they already have. They wanted to have enough food and enough opportunities, other opportunities for all the children they have. So starting from 1920s, I'm sorry, I forgot to change the slide. Starting from 1920s, in those areas which were more prosperous, demographic transition started. So during the 1920s and 1930s, families with one child or two children, which represented a complete rarity before the First World War, became a commonplace. At the same time, in those regions that were underdeveloped and more poor than, for example, Slavonia, parts of Serbia, Slovenia, and so on, families with 8, 9, or 10 children also represented a commonplace. Still, due to certain modernization that happened during 20s and especially during 30s, views on sex and sexuality started to slowly change. Although sexuality was during the interwar period, like in many other European countries, a taboo about which was little known and even less was said, situation started to change So more and more people were interested in how to prevent unwanted pregnancy. Still, contraception was basically, well, forbidden, because although you could buy condoms in the pharmacies, one could only buy contraceptives on prescription. And you could get prescription at the doctor's office only in the case of medical necessity. That would mean that, for example, if a husband or a wife had some grave disease, which would endanger her health in the case of pregnancy or the health of the unborn child, then the couple had the right to buy contraceptives in pharmacy. At least it was on the official. Officially. Unofficially, you could probably buy everything in the pharmacy without the prescription if you wanted to pay. But the problem was that most of the population was poorly educated, and they didn't even know anything about contraception nor about mechanical ways, for example, coitus interruptus, on how to prevent pregnancy. So in this situation, a lot of prejudice were widespread, and superstition was widespread in Yugoslavia. So in some parts of Yugoslavia, it was believed that if a woman was breastfeeding a child, she couldn't stay pregnant. While in Montenegro, it was believed that if sexual intercourse was violent or a woman was angry during this intercourse, it would also prevent pregnancy. I think that on the next slide, yes, I wanted to show you this. This is our original package of condoms from the end of 1930s. And you could even find the commercials about condoms in the newspapers, but still officially you could buy it only on prescription, but unofficially I think that they were available in bigger pharmacies in towns. So there was one small number of people who lived mostly in the cities, who could be informed on how to prevent pregnancy for newspapers, articles, from books and booklets which were translated mostly from English and German during 1920s and 1930s, and of course from articles published in experts' journals. However, it is important to emphasize that even in this situation, one could read in the press that contraception is dangerous for health, both physical and psychological health. And those were articles which were authored by most prominent gynecologists of the time. And it's also important to say that those were not originally their own ideas. They usually read it somewhere. For example, they usually quoted one Czechoslovakian gynecologist. So those ideas about contraception were also widespread or spread in Europe at the time as well. In some parts of Yugoslavia, peasants knew that it was possible to prevent or try to prevent pregnancy with coitus interruptus, while the people in Slavonia practice it, because the main goal was to have just one or two children in order to prevent the division of land during the inheritance process. In other parts, for example, in villages around Ogul in Croatia, peasants believed that they are deprived of on many things in life because of their poverty, so that they should, because of their poverty, enjoy in sex, I quote, in its true and natural way. So there were, and of course in many villages, population didn't know anything about ways to prevent unwanted pregnancy. So the region for abortions were mainly the same all over Yugoslavia. First of all, economic difficulties, low standard of living, agrarian overpopulation, the division of property, with each generation ended up with less and less property because of this inheritance process, and of course, little opportunity to go to the city or town to find an employment. And also, even if the family was more wealthy, it was very difficult to buy the land because plots of land were already taken. So this was like the main goal for a population in more prosperous areas to try to prevent, to control birth. One doctor from Belgrade, his name was Aleksandar Petrović, did a vast research in the villages around Belgrade and one village in Western Serbia. And he talked to peasants about their everyday life. So one of the topics he talked about was also pregnancy and unwanted pregnancy. And according to results of his research, he found out that usually women gave birth to first, second, and the third child. And in the case of fourth pregnancy, they would always ask a question whether to give birth or not. And curiously enough, decision on abortion was made usually, actually in most cases, both partners made the decision. So both men and women were opted for abortion in order to try to save the life standard of the family. So the only the first time decision for abortion was somehow caused some kind of moral discomfort. But according to his research, every other time a decision to go for illegal abortion, of course, was made almost automatically without thinking. So he talked to peasants and he asked women from the villages, isn't it a sin to kill a child in the womb? And the woman would answer by asking another question, isn't it a sin to watch a children suffer? So in Serbia, the lack of stronger influence in Serbia, the lack of stronger influence of church and also the notion that the life of a child begins on the date of birth and not before made it easier for residents of Serbia, inhabitants of Serbia, to make a decision to go on a legal abortion. And such practice was justified with economic difficulties. And one of the peasants who talked to Dr. Aleksandar Petrović said, earlier in old times when property was large, we loved children. Every new child then meant a new worker in the house. Now the property is small. Every new child is a new trouble for a peasant. So in every village across Yugoslavia lived a woman who knew how to provoke abortion and to more or less control the flow of abortion. So in most cases, illegal abortions, were done by opening the uterus with some object. It could be the knitting needles, the wire, even the wire from the umbrellas were used, the keys were used. And in more prosperous areas, they knew how to use quinine in order to start the abortion, or women would usually sit over steaming water in order to try to provoke miscarriage. So depending on the development from region to region, in some regions they knew how to sterilize those instruments, primitive instruments, while in other regions they knew nothing about it. So the mortality and morbidity was really very high, and each year a lot of women, hundreds of women were dying because of abortion in which something went wrong, mostly because the conditions in which those abortions were done were completely unsterile. On the other hand, in towns, especially in big cities, there were clinics where city ladies who were better off could afford illegal abortion, but had to pay around 2,000 dinars, which was approximately the worker's wage for 3 or 4 months of an unskilled worker. So it was a kind of luxury that not many families could afford. On the other hand, a certain modernization, even in this field, could be noticed in Slavonia, where women knew a lot about female anatomy, and there were cases, as there was a case in one village around Osijek, that the whole village united funds in order to buy a female catheter in the pharmacy, and this catheter was used in order to start the abortion. So there were also cases that women, brides before marriage, would be given this catheter before the wedding as a dowry. And in Slavonia, they knew how to disinfect these catheters, so they did it by disinfecting it with brandy or just boiled it in boiling water. So despite of this, despite of this modernization, still a lot of women was dying, even in Slavonia, because of uterus ruptures, because of sepsis, blood poisoning, etc. And to what extent the consequences of illegal abortions were tremendous. One doctor, a very prominent gynecologist from Zagreb, wrote, he said, "We need to ask our hospitals and doctors in practice what today's female clientele looks like. Abortion after abortion, one worse than other, one harder than other. Terrible consequences, excess mortality. Is anyone concerned about applying statistics on our abortion? Have there anyone of those who is constantly watching those mutilated, half-dead women after the criminal act of abortion found themselves raising their voice, both as a doctor and as a man, to demand that anything be done to prevent and eliminate or minimize this distress? One could not hear it from anywhere, only the constant requests of those who apodictically seek the law against abortion." So the state authorities try to prevent illegal abortions by repressive measures. The penal code from 1929, I will later explain the photo. The penal code from 1929 said that defined abortion as a criminal act that was punishable with 3 to 5 years of imprisonment. Both abortionist and the woman who had an abortion were to be punished. However, one important novelty was included in this penalty, and that was that abortion from medical indication was allowed. So if a woman had a difficult medical condition, some serious illness that would endanger her life during the pregnancy or the life of a child, she would then be granted to have a legal abortion. Also, it was said that unmarried girls who provoked abortion by themselves and finished abortion by themselves could be acquitted at court. However, although these repressive measures were really harsh, in reality, the state authorities just turned blind eyes. So not many people, both abortionists and women, finished in court. For example, in Belgrade in 1923, only one person was punished because of the abortion. And similar statistics was in other parts of Yugoslavia in other periods. However, because of this a huge number of illegal abortions. Nobody knew how many exactly abortions were done in Yugoslavia per year because they were done illegally, but there is an assumption that around 50,000 abortion was done every year. The doctors, especially doctors from general practitioners and lawyers and jurists started debating during the 1930s for social indication or against social indication. So the main dilemma was whether to approve legal abortion on basis of economic difficulties and other social difficulties. On the Congress held in 1935, doctors issued a resolution in which it was asked that the authorities were asked to include the social indication into the abortion law. But authorities did not react at all. So they just pretended that no resolution was ever issued. However, it's also important to stress that the main motive of doctors was to alleviate the difficult social conditions in which Yugoslav population lived. So they were afraid that if the family would have too many children, that all these children would live in misery and a lot of them would die because of hunger, because of diseases, etc. So they believed that it is better to have 2 or 3 children and to be able to fully support them than to have, for example, 10 children who would die out of hunger and disease, etc. So they didn't share some liberal views that abortion should be allowed because each woman has the right to decide about her own body. But it was rather the kind of social assistance that society should provide in order to alleviate the difficult situation in which most families lived in. And just to go back to show you the picture, this is the picture from the clinic near Belgrade from 1922. So this is how the conditions in the doctor's offices looked like. And it is also important to stress, I forgot to say it in the introduction, that in Yugoslavia, the doctors, especially in the rural areas, were scarce and clinics were also scarce. So even if this social indication was allowed, it wouldn't change much because most of the population didn't have the physical access to the medical care. And there were whole regions in which like 100,000 people lived and didn't have a single doctor. Those were the poorest, of course, the poorest regions in Yugoslavia. So after the Second World War, the Communist Party came to power and completely changed the legislation. And of course, it led not only the legislation, but the whole system, which caused great socioeconomic changes. The new constitution was issued in 1946, and it represented a kind of, a rewritten constitution of the Soviet Union from 1930s. And according to this constitution, at least legally, women and men were completely equal in rights, and women were granted all political and civil rights. So legally, women from 1946 ceased to be subordinated to their husbands, and spouses had the same rights and responsibilities as regards the children. During the 50s and 60s, big changes occurred, so the traditional gender roles started to change, and women started to choose their life partners independently, and spouses became more and more partners. Although this was a very big improvement, the socialist reality still deviated from the ideal socialist, imaginary socialist concept. So the differences between women and men were still very pronounced, and it was believed in most circles that the main duty of each woman was to be a mother. So in the case of surplus of workers in the factories and in companies, even during the 60s, usually women would be fired, no matter how educated or capable or hardworking they were, because it was believed that they, if they're married, they already have a husband who provides for them. On the other hand, in the case of divorce, woman was usually the one who had to take care of the children, since in most cases, men didn't want to pay the alimony, although it was their legal responsibility. Also, during the 50s and early 60s, attitudes towards sex and sexuality changed, and there was much freer behavior of youth. It was clearly visible that youth is more open and is more eager to show emotions than the previous generations. So also the notions towards premarital sex started changing, and this was influenced by several factors. One of the most important factors was popular culture, because the youth who lived in big towns and cities was very much into popular culture that came from the Western Europe and America. And of course, especially popular were the movies that came from Hollywood, but also Italian and Western European movies. Due to the cinematography, love and not marriage like it was before became something to be dreamed of, and became a thing that was desired. Also, big migrations, rural-urban migrations also favored, totally in a different sense, favored this more open attitudes towards relationship and towards showing emotions. Because a lot of young people who were in their 20s came from rural areas to towns. They found employment in the industry, but due to the housing shortages, they couldn't find flats and they couldn't afford flats in the cities, so they were compelled to live in the provisory barracks around the factories, which were built which factories built to accommodate them. And in those really poor conditions, both men and women lived together. It was room next to room. They didn't have, they couldn't afford anything. Wages were really very low. They were undereducated, not very interested in cultural possibilities that town offered. Of course, they couldn't, even if they were, they couldn't afford, for example, to go to movies, etc. So they somehow engaged, started relationships more freely than they would do that in the villages. And also there was another factor. When they moved, they gained some economic independence and didn't have this strict control of family, of relatives, of neighbors, which was also very typical for the villages. So the old patriarchal moral views were somehow shattered, and the new one were still not formed. And during that time, especially during 50s and early 60s, it was very difficult for a lot of young people to say what is allowed, what should be done, and what shouldn't be done. So in those circumstances, many believed, especially young girls believed, that engaging in sexual intercourse somehow represents formalization of the relationship. And even the party reports say that illegitimate children were born by girls who wanted to get married and then believed the promises of the young man. So in case of unwanted pregnancy, extramarital pregnancy, girls had 3 options. One option was to get married, and I assume that many resolved the problem by getting married. The second one was to seek backstreet abortion, is to have an illegal abortion. And the third one was to become a single mother, and that was the least favorable options of all, because during 50s, 60s, and even early 70s, women who choose to be single parents were heavily stigmatized. Even the children were stigmatized. So it was really very difficult to live, since the family would just renounce them, and they would usually had to leave their job because they would be fired because of bad moral behavior. So although it was a lot of said about illegitimate pregnancies who were terminated with abortion, much more abortions was used as the main mean of family planning between the married couples. So I will just show you the photos. Those were girls who mostly came from the villages and then found employment in the industry. So you see how they still have this head scarf as they used to wear in the villages. So these were newly erected buildings on the outskirts of Belgrade, and the girls passing by. And these are the 60s. You can see the change, although these are the models from Zagreb. But you see that fashion is now trendy, and this attitude is trendy. So if you have in mind those previous photos and this one, you can see the change that, that happened for 10 or maybe 15 years. As I previously said, a lot of couples, most couples planned family using the abortion as practically the method of contraception. And that is something which will be characteristic for Yugoslavia for the whole period, again, until the dissolution. So although the party leaders had quite liberal attitudes in the interwar Yugoslavia regarding abortion, and they were advocating for a liberalization of abortion, once they came to power, situation changed. So they didn't talk, their attitudes towards abortion until early 50s was almost the same as the attitudes of the interwar government. So they just pretended that nothing was going on, nothing was happening. And there was a certain legal vacuum that lasted from 1945 to 1951, because the old penal code from 1929 ceased to be valid, and the new one that was issued in 1947 didn't mention abortion at all. So in this period, abortions were allowed, illegal abortions were allowed only because of medical indication. So it was the same practice as in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And only in the case of really serious illness, women would be granted the right to an abortion. However, although the number of cases although the number of women who terminated the pregnancy in the hospitals was relatively small, doctors were very dissatisfied because, especially gynecologists, because they believed that even the small number is too big, and that not so many abortions should be allowed. So two gynecologists from Zagreb published several articles in expert journals saying that a lot of women actually nurture their diseases in order to have the right to terminate the pregnancy in case of necessity. Actually, they wanted to say that a lot of women didn't go to the regular checkups on purpose and didn't take their therapy in order to have an excuse if they stayed pregnant, to have an excuse for the abortion. So this is the clinic from 1950. It was in Belgrade, the picture was taken in Belgrade. This is one propaganda poster. It says the birth should be given in the clean facilities, in the clean bed. This was from the exhibition that traveled around Yugoslavia in order to educate the population on certain health topics, including giving birth. And this is also from 1950, a doctor talking to mothers and giving advice on various aspects of taking care of children, also from 1950. So, however, the number of abortions was rising from year to year, especially from 1948, because in first 4 years, couples had bigger desire to have offsprings. Probably it happens after every war. There is desire to somehow increase birth rate in order to respond to the demographic losses that happened in war. But from 1948, really worrying reports came all over Yugoslavia saying that tremendous consequences of illegal abortions. There are tremendous consequences of illegal abortions, that many women are dying because of these abortions, and many seeking medical help. Those who were lucky enough to live in towns usually went to hospital after the problems with the flow of illegal abortion. So authorities asked the doctors to formalize their viewpoints on the abortion. So after the consults, gynecologists and all medical associations decided that legal abortion should be permitted only for medical and socio-medical indication and in case of incest and rape. They also said that all abortions should be done in clinics and that they should be done only in the case if pregnancy is up to 3 months old. If the pregnancy was older than that, then abortion shouldn't be done even from the medical reasons. The first step towards liberalization of abortion was the resolution which was issued in 1952. And basically, it consisted of the views of the doctors which were given to the authorities. So, according to this regulation, abortion should be done on medical, moral, ethical, and socio-medical indication. And the commissions were formed. Commissions consisted of doctors who were to decide whether to approve abortion or not. Despite the commissions were guided by very strict criteria, from 1955, more and more abortions was approved only because of the social circumstances. So the medical the medical condition was just mechanically added in order to have like the legal excuse for this practice. Spouses planned small families and very small families that usually consisted of 1 child or 2 children, mostly because of economic circumstances, and they used abortion as the main mean of family planning. So on one hand, state authorities were not able to educate the population, although they made some efforts, unsuccessful efforts. They were not able to offer cheap and reliable contraceptives because there were shortages on the market during 50s and 60s, even the 70s and 80s. This varied from time to time, but still there were shortages. And of course, they couldn't significantly improve the standard of living. So their somehow solution for this economic crisis was to turn the blind eye and to allow abortions. So this policy was to some extent, although in completely different political and socioeconomic framework, it was to some extent similar to the policies of the interwar government. Still, doctors were very dissatisfied. Even in 1953, they issued a resolution on the Congress of Gynecologists asking the state to make the regulation more strict. Of course, this was totally against official policy, so the party officials and the mass organizations reacted, and Vida Tomšić, which was one of the main, she was a spokeswoman on this issue. She said that doctors still have double standards and that it would be better, I quote, if comrade doctors stayed in the field of medical science, as women should not be discussed like a major threat to the lives of the children, end of quotation. Still, she was also against the introduction of social indication, but she favored more flexible interpretation of the regulation. So from 1955, this more flexible interpretation of the regulation led to the rising numbers of abortion. So basically, almost by the end of 50s, almost all abortions were approved on the basis of difficult living conditions. So in 1960, it was already clear that something has to be done and that regulation has to be changed. So in 1960, a new regulation on abortion was issued, and social indication was included in this regulation. So Yugoslavia thus followed Eastern European trend. And since the abortion was legalized, partly legalized in Soviet Union in 1955, then in Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary in 1956, and in Czechoslovakia in 1957. So in order to have an abortion, women had to apply to the Commission and to provide documentation which would demonstrate that they were living in difficult conditions. So they had to demonstrate that they had unresolved housing situation, low wages, a lot of children, and so on. And that this regulation stipulated that commissions should also have educational role. So idea was when a woman comes to the commission that she would be given advice on how to use contraceptives, and she would be explained that, as she was supposed to be explained, that abortion is actually a serious medical intervention, as doctors at the time believed, and that abortion can seriously endanger her health and even her life and subsequent pregnancies. Still, this proved to be a dead letter, since the number of women coming to the commissions was very huge, and the doctors did not have time to deal with this educational, provide this educational note for women. According to the statistics available in the period from 1963 to 1967, more than 1,200,000 of abortions were performed, and of which was more than 300,000 were illegal abortions. So this new regulation that was issued in 1960 played a significant role reducing the number of illegal abortions, and it was its main purpose. But it somehow contributed to the notion of Yugoslav population that abortion actually represents the easiest way of preventing birth, and that it represents a form of contraception. And of course, there were really big, the authorities were not able to educate the population to use contraceptives. So that was the downside of this whole policy of Communist Party towards the abortion. And since from mid-60s, almost all abortions that were permitted on individual basis in practice. I mean, every woman could submit documentation that testified that her living conditions would become more serious if she had another child or had a child. So authorities decided to completely liberalize the abortion, and in 1969, the family planning resolution was issued in April of 1969, and according to this resolution, every child was supposed to be born as wanted, and the right of the parents to decide on the birth gap and the number of children was defined as the basic human right. Although it was said that abortion should be least desirable form of birth control and should be resorted only as a last resort when unintended conception had already occurred. And after this resolution, just several days after, a general law on termination of pregnancy was adopted, which contained all kinds of indication for termination of pregnancy, including the individual one. So I'll just try to say this is a scene from the hospital from 1970s. I just wanted to say something shortly about contraception. Contraception was legal in the socialist Yugoslavia from the very beginning. The first contraceptives appeared during 1950s, mid-50s. It was the diaphragm, which was produced by one Slovenian firm. Although the quality of its quality was very low, and it was said that it was much different than the diaphragms that could be bought in the West. Women, in theory, had the access to it in pharmacies in bigger cities, but of course they would have to go to the doctor's office to have it in order to use it. So these are the photographs of condoms produced in Yugoslavia. The photographs are from 1960s, and you see the commercial they were sold on. The title they were sold, Risk, No Risk, and they were produced by this Risk factory, and so this was also the commercial that you have no risk, although couples complain that they're also of very poor quality. This is intrauterine device. It's called Beospir, also designed in Yugoslavia in 1964. It was never popular, and for some reason never popular. And also it's important to say that pills also appeared in 1964, and Yugoslav factories produced pills. There were, I think, around 12 different pills, but they were on the basis of same hormonal, on same hormones, so they were not so different. And this is the photo of Emco foam. It was sent from United States in 1963 as a form of help in order, since, as I said, the contraceptives used to be scarce from time to time in Yugoslav pharmacies. So 9 tons of this foam was sent in order to alleviate these shortages. However, most of the population until the end of Yugoslavia never used medical contraception. Some of the couples used coitus interruptus, although they were aware that it is not a reliable method of preventing pregnancy. But those things never changed until the split of Yugoslavia. The change came later during the 90s, when the population became, younger population became more educated and more aware of AIDS and other sexual diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. So that was the those were the reasons why the condoms became more popular. And just to conclude, so what was the difference between politics of socialist Yugoslavia and policy towards family planning and policy towards family planning in Western and Eastern Europe? Well, in socialist Yugoslavia, when the authorities decided to give the right for abortion, each law on and each regulation on abortion was one step further towards the liberalization on abortion. While in Eastern Europe, in most countries except for Poland, they were coming back and forth. They would issue a law on abortion which was more liberal, and then several years after, they would issue a law which was more strict. Also, the novelty in Yugoslavia was that the population policy was never discussed. It was a sort of taboo. So population policy and abortion were not discussed together, while in Eastern Europe, in the fear of, I'm sorry, because of the fear of demographic transformation, they made laws on abortion more strict. Sorry. On the other hand, in Western Europe, abortion was liberalized after the liberalization in Yugoslavia. I'm sorry. But it was never used in Yugoslavia as a means of contraception. So, and also the difference in Yugoslavia, women were granted the right on abortion. Feminist organizations never had nothing. They didn't fight for the, actually there were no feminist organizations during 50s and 60s, but still there was no activists fighting for abortion, unlike in Western Europe that activists actually fought for abortion for a while, and then women were granted the right on abortion. So if I have to conclude what was the specificity of Yugoslav policy, well, Yugoslav policy towards family planning was not that successful, having in mind that all these regulations only succeeded in reducing the number of illegal abortions. Since the sex education was never included in schools, although it was discussed, and contraception, people were never educated about contraception, it turned out that modernization in this field, like in many other fields, somehow ended halfway. So the only plus of family planning policy was exactly this reduction of the number of illegal abortions. So I'm sorry, I have to stop now. It was already too long. And please ask any question that you are interested in. And I'm sorry for speaking for an hour. It was too long.
But it was very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's great. You can ask questions now. And I will pass around the microphone. So maybe I will ask the first question. Would you say the liberalization of abortion was a step forward for the women, for the Yugoslav women at the end, or?
Yes, I would definitely say, I mean, it's always a step forward. And it was something that absolutely should be done. But the problem is that education actually failed. So instead of educating the population, I think that authorities just were satisfied with granting the right on abortion, and they completely forgot about this topic. Although a lot was discussed about contraception, about rising awareness of importance of contraception, about importance of introducing sexual education in schools. Like in many other fields, it just remained a pure discussion without any results. Because usually when you do a research on socialist Yugoslavia, you see that many really good ideas are being discussed. And it would be great if somebody could implement all of this. But somehow it all ends in the same way. Nothing happens. You just have a discussion, then a conference, then a resolution, then you, I don't know, write a book on something, and then when you have to implement all of this, then somehow the state fails. But it is also important to say that, well, it is difficult to say that, I mean, it's harsh to say the dissolution of Yugoslavia started during the 60s, but republics, even during the 60s, became more and more apart. So in some republics, for example, in Slovenia, there were really big efforts in promoting contraception. And Slovenian doctors were the they advocated against complete liberalization of abortion, not because they were too conservative and so on, but because they believed, actually they anticipated, that if you allow abortion and you don't educate the population, then abortion will become actually a contraceptive, a mean of contraception. So it turned out that they were right, but the Slovenian authorities managed to do much better and to educate the population. And the number of couples who used contraception in Slovenia was the highest in all Yugoslavia. So even during the 60s, when the abortion was on the rise in all other Yugoslav republics, in Slovenia it was declining, but the situation changed during the mid-70s because of this. There was a big economic crisis started, and there were shortages of contraceptives, among other things, in Yugoslav pharmacies. So the couples who already used contraception couldn't find these contraceptives they were using in the pharmacy. So the number of abortions, even in Slovenia, was on the rise during the mid-70s.
You said that there was resistance against the introduction of sexual education in Yugoslavia, and how do we have to imagine this resistance in a dictatorship, or what kind of resistance?
So the discussion about the introduction of sexual education started during the 50s. And there was a compulsory subject by the end of the 50s, which was called moral education. And it was supposed to, teachers were also supposed to discuss some topics from the, for example, to discuss puberty with the pupils and differences between sexes and so on, relationship and so on. And the teachers were, I mean, those were the people coming from mostly patriarchal background, because they were like in their 30s, in their 40s, so they were pre-war generations, and they were reluctant to speak about those topics. So later in the 60s, a new discussion started, and it was said that instead of sex education, humanization of the sexes should be included into curricula, but not as one. Well, let me explain what humanization means. It means that the authorities tried to educate children that women and men, or boys and girls, should live in harmony, should respect one another and so on, and that they should respect each other in the relationship, in marriage and so on. And the idea was somehow to prepare them for marriage and for family. But although it might seem as a good idea, because they wanted to include these topics in various subjects, for example, in biology, on biology classes, the difference between sexes would be discussed, the puberty, contraception, and so on. But on history classes, examples from history about relationships would be discussed, about differences towards relationship and differences between sexes in different historical perspective and so on. And in literature, of course, romantic literature would be discussed. Nothing actually happened. Only in curricula of biology, there were lessons about puberty and so on, and it was done on classes. I remember that from the 80s. And in every other class, nothing was done because teachers were too ashamed to speak with their students. And even, according to the sources, even when the students would ask a question about relationship or, I don't know, sexual intercourse, contraception, teachers would usually reply that they're too young, that they speak nonsense. So they would be harsh to the students. And that used to happen during the 80s also. So with the time, students somehow accepted that they cannot find information nor at home in their families, which were also quite patriarchal, nor in the school. So this whole idea of introducing sex education and educating children just didn't have any results. For example, there were some experimental sex classes of, in some schools there were experimental classes of sex education in some towns in Croatia and also in one school in Belgrade. And parents, which were the most educated ones, were most against these classes because they believed that if students talk about sexuality in schools, that they would be encouraged to have sexual intercourse after school and so on. So there was a big fear that introduction of sex education could actually provoke the rising number of adolescent pregnancies and so on. But still, it happened even without sexual education. So.
But what about sexual education in youth magazines? Did it happen there?
Yes, a lot of magazines started publishing texts from early 60s, but those were usually translations coming from newspapers from America, from Western Europe, and so on. And usually there were also some pornographic magazines. I mean, you could buy it on the kiosk and have on the front cover, you could have a picture of a usually naked woman. And party leaders and party officials usually heavily criticized it because they thought that these magazines are not actually publishing educational articles, but in order to somehow sell more copies, they are publishing something that is of they're publishing articles of very low quality that are not in accordance with morality, official morality or whatever. So during the early 60s, you could read a lot about poor quality of those papers in sources. But from 70s onward, I think that nobody really cared. I mean, you could publish anything. And of course, those magazines and those articles were the only source of information for the youth at the time. And there was one research in Bosnia in the end of 60s where researchers talked to boys and girls in the final year of secondary school. And a lot of them complained that they have very strict parents, that parents do not allow them to go out with boys or girls to have a relationship, and that they are supposed to get married in 2 or 3 years, and they don't know anything about pregnancy, contraception, sex, or whatever. So there was a kind of nobody wanted to talk with children because parents always believed that children are too young for such talks, and they also frequently mentioned that nobody talked with them either, and they turned perfectly fine, and they managed to get married and everything. And on the other hand, in school, it was believed that it is a duty of the parents to speak with their children. And on the other hand, the doctors were not also eager to work on the education of the population because they believed that it is a duty of family and of school. So everybody thought that educating both adults and school children is the duty of somebody else. So.
Other questions?
Towards the end of your lecture, you talked about the differences in how those matters were handled in Western Europe and the US versus Yugoslavia, and you pointed out the specificities of this in Yugoslavia. But at some point earlier, you also mentioned that Yugoslavia followed suit in the liberalization of the regulations in comparison to other Eastern European countries. Are there any differences between the socialist countries? So is there anything specific about Yugoslavian regulations compared to other socialist countries?
Yes, there is, because during the 50s, most of socialist countries in the East liberalized abortion to some extent. It was not completely liberalized, but mostly on basis of social indication. But later, when they saw that the number of abortion is rising, like it was on the rise in Yugoslavia, and basically there were the same motives for couples all over the Eastern Europe on why they choose to have a small and very small family. During the 60s and 70s, these regulations became more strict in Eastern Europe. For example, in Romania, it was almost impossible to have an abortion under Ceausescu. And also, there were quite strict regulations in other Eastern European countries. I exclude Poland because I think that Poland is, I mean, as far as I know, Poland had a similar policy as Yugoslavia. Each regulation was more liberal than the previous one until the 90s. Then in the 90s, they changed the attitude. But if we speak about socialism, and also in Yugoslavia, family planning policy was never discussed together with the population policy. So Yugoslav government didn't want, and officials didn't want to have a bigger birth rate or to have a smaller birth rate. That was not the policy of Yugoslavia. That changed only in the April of 1989 because of the big population birth rate in Kosovo. And then in 1989, one resolution was issued that said that ideal family should have between 2 or 3 children. And that is because probably this resolution was issued because of this big birth rate in Kosovo. But it was already in the final years of Yugoslavia, so nothing was done on this matter. Although there was some kind of mutual agreement that in order to make Kosovo more economically prosperous, the number of births should be somehow reduced by educating population on how to use contraception, but it never happened. So I think that the biggest difference is that this attitudes towards population policy in Yugoslavia and in other Eastern European countries.
Other question? We have time for maybe 2 or 3. I have a lot of questions. I was wondering why the pill was so rarely used in Yugoslavia. Have you an explanation?
Yes, because at first doctors were very skeptical, gynecologists were very skeptical about the pill, and it was said that general practitioners cannot prescribe the pill, only the gynecologists. And of course, some gynecologists believed that it was very dangerous because of the hormones and so on. And also, a lot of articles was published in the press. Those were not only Yugoslav articles, but translations coming from, as I found out in sources, mostly from French and I think maybe German magazines. And the women were really very scared because they thought that the health risks were very huge, but they never, it is a kind of interesting thing, they never thought about the health risks of abortion. So a lot of women believe that contraception is dangerous and can be dangerous, but almost none of the women who went for, who planned their family by abortion thought that abortions could be harmful and risky. So, and I think that if the doctors were more eager to popularize the contraception and to explain what are the benefits of the contraception, especially of the pill, situation would probably change. But there was one research done at the end of 80s. One doctor, she's now more demographer, but her basic education is medicine. She talked to the women who came to the clinics in Belgrade to do abortion in 1989. And she also talked about contraception. And all of them, for some reason, feared to use the pill because they believed that pill can cause cancer, that it is dangerous, that it provokes all kinds of health problems. So somehow this notion was created that contraception could be more harmful than abortion, and it only changed during the 90s, and of course later.
Maybe a last question. You mentioned the 90s. Can you briefly describe the situation after 1991?
Well, it depends from the republic to the republic. For example, in Serbia during the early 90s, there were some discussions on whether to continue with this complete liberal law on abortion or not. But these discussions were really very brief and didn't result in any problem. I mean, they didn't cause any problems because the law stayed the same, and it's still the same. And as far as I know, in each Serbian constitution, this right to freely decide on number of children is still included. I mean, it was included during the 90s, and it is still somewhere in the constitution. So I would say that this topic is completely off the table. I mean, nothing is off the table completely, but they're not serious discussions, and I really hope that there will not be serious discussions on abortion, because I strongly believe that it should be as legal as it is. But in other republics, there were, I think, more serious discussions. And recently in Croatia, there was a case of a pregnant woman who had some medical complications. She was in advanced pregnancy, and she was supposed to have an abortion for medical indication. But since the pregnancy was advanced, I think that nobody in Croatia wanted to do the procedure, and then she had to go to Slovenia to do it. So I think that in Croatia there are serious debates. Bosnia, I suppose so, but I don't know. But as far as I know, in all ex-Yugoslav countries, abortion is still legal, and they still have the same laws as this law was in 1969. I mean, more or less, it's very similar. It's just rewritten and reissued, but it stayed the same, as far as I know.
We have time for one more question. there are no questions, I would like to thank you again. Hvala vam puno da ste došli i bilo je stvarno super, odlično izlaganje, ja sam puno naučio. Ich danke auch Ihnen, dass Sie gekommen sind und mitdiskutiert haben, und ich hoffe, wir sehen uns in 2 Wochen wieder, wenn Peter Hallermar über Vaterschaft im Sozialismus, vor allem in Ostmitteleuropa, sprechen wird. Danke, einen schönen Abend.